Good morning, and thank you for being here today. My name is Michael Dougherty, and I have the honor of being the District Attorney for the 20th Judicial District, which is Boulder County. And I want to start by thanking Sheriff Johnson for that very thorough presentation. I'm going to seek to not repeat everything he has said, but I'm going to touch on some of the things that we worked on in conjunction with the Sheriff's Office. We did, as the Sheriff noted, have a very close working relationship with the Sheriff's Office throughout this entire investigation. That started when Joe Pelley was our sheriff and continued under the leadership and direction of Sheriff Johnson. I will just share with you that on the day and night of the fire, when I responded to the Emergency Command Center, and I could see in the distance the fire spreading incredibly quickly and different plumes of flames jumping, and I realized and was told those were different houses going up throughout the community. Standing next to me was Sheriff Johnson, and his house was one of those over 1,100 homes that were devastated on December 30th of that year. For Sheriff Johnson and his family, and for all the community members who were impacted, our commitment from the very beginning was to conduct and assist and then review an exhaustive investigation and to leave no stone unturned. That was our commitment since day one. Recognizing how many people had their lives devastated, how many homes were destroyed, how many pets were killed, and then also the two victims who tragically lost their lives, Edna Turnbull and Robert Sharp. We also had members of the District Attorney's Office who were directly impacted by the fire. So from the very beginning, our commitment was to leave no stone unturned in conducting an incredibly thorough, exhaustive investigation, and then to share the results of that investigation with our community members. So from the beginning, we were working as a second pair of eyes, along with the Sheriff's Office, with assistance from the United States Forest Service, the Department of Mining and Reclamation Services, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, outside experts, electrical engineers, other law enforcement agencies. We also were committed to being transparent. So as the sheriff noted, but it bears repeating, this presentation is being recorded and it's going to be put on the sheriff's website, available for everybody in the community to watch. We also have put together a summary report that captures the findings of the Sheriff's Office, the District Attorney's Office, the U.S. Forest Service, and the experts that we utilized during the course of this investigation. That summary report will be provided to you today and to the community today as well. In addition, all the body-worn camera video that has not yet been released will be released by the Sheriff's Office. The experts' reports will be available on the Sheriff's website. The police reports will be available on the Sheriff's website. So I would invite and encourage community members and, of course, members of the media to look through those materials, to take a look at everything we looked at, everything the investigators worked to gather, and everything that leads us to our conclusions that we share with you today. The District Attorney's Office assisted in the investigation and review of this case. We went through all the evidence, documents, and materials in conjunction with the investigation by the Sheriff's Office and other agencies. The District Attorney's Office joins in the conclusions that the Sheriff's Office investigators reached in this case. And those are shared in the summary report that Sheriff Johnson and I put together with help from our staff. Additionally, the District Attorney's Office looked to see if it would be possible or justified to charge any criminal offenses in connection with the cause and origin of the Marshall Fire. The decision of the District Attorney's Office, which is that there's insufficient or no evidence of a crime having been committed, is consistent with the findings by the Sheriff's Office investigators, the U.S. Forest Service, and also the experts who worked on this case. I will say that the law and ethical rules for prosecutors require us to only file charges when there's evidence of a crime, and when that evidence can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. The decision we reached today is based on input from the experts, the investigators, but also going through the case with different investigators and different prosecutors unconnected to the investigation, getting their feedback, their direction, their questions, to continue driving the investigation forward and ensuring that we make the right decision for our community today. I will say the criminal standard for proving criminal offenses is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That is, of course, as you know, higher than what's required in civil law and civil practice. So in criminal law, we have a much higher standard of proving cases beyond a reasonable doubt. It's the highest standard in a court of law and the highest standard in the country, of course. This fire was terribly destructive and traumatic for so many people. We make our decisions about charging criminal offenses based on evidence and not based on emotion. So we've gone through all of the evidence in the case. And what I want to just really stress for the community is if we were to tell you today that we were filing charges, it would be wrong and unethical. We can only file charges when there's evidence of a crime having been committed. And I'm going to go through each one of these things and talk to you about where we have insufficient evidence, or for a couple things, actually no evidence that a crime was committed based on the exhaustive investigation that was conducted here. And if we were to tell you that we were filing charges today, I imagine some people would cheer that decision because of how much people have suffered in this community. That cheering would come to an abrupt stop in about 6 weeks, because we'd have our first court hearing where we have to show a judge that we have evidence to move forward with a criminal prosecution, and a judge would dismiss this prosecution for a lack of any evidence. Also, doing that would violate the ethical rules and the law for prosecutors, and my sworn responsibility to this community to always seek to do the right thing based on the evidence that we have available to us. So I'm going to go through the analysis and where we have insufficient, or for a couple of things I'll cover, no evidence that a crime was committed. Obviously, if additional information comes to light through the civil litigation that will certainly be taking place and that's already underway, then the Sheriff's Office and the District Attorney's Office would review it and reconsider it. We've had an exhaustive criminal investigation, and I want to highlight that while what we're sharing today will certainly be of relevance and interest and perhaps value in civil litigation, we are focused on the criminal investigation and whether there was sufficient evidence for criminal charges. So first, with regards to 5325 El Dorado, which is represented by that red dot at the top of the photo, 2 to my left. I'll step over and show it to you. Sorry. There was physical examination, drones utilized, thermal imaging, a burn pattern analysis, and through all that, the investigators and experts determined the fire originated from the remnants of the December 24th fire, which is depicted in this first photograph here to my left. We have, as you likely know if you live in Boulder County or another community like Boulder, but if you live in a metro region, you may not be aware of this. In more rural communities, we have hundreds of fires set by property owners every year. And that's in Boulder County alone when I say hundreds. So hundreds of fires are set by property owners every year. Obviously, it has to be in certain conditions, and I'll talk about that as we go through this. But the United States Forest Service concluded that the extraordinarily high winds that we faced on December 30th uncovered the buried fire from December 24th that had been set by the residents of 5325 El Dorado. The wind then blew those embers across the property and caught fire. In reaching that conclusion, the United States Forest Service, as the sheriff mentioned, also worked with the United States Department of Agriculture and the Missoula Fire Sciences Laboratory. And we learned that fire that is buried by dirt, that has smoldering embers, can go for hours, days, weeks, and in some conditions even months. And in the materials we'll be sharing through the sheriff's website today, you'll see that in the experts' reports. And you'll also see the research that they looked at in reaching those conclusions. So all that information will be provided to you. As the sheriff mentioned, but I want to highlight the video of the shed that was on fire on December 30th, which went viral. That shed was not on fire when first responders arrived on scene there. The excavation of the shed discovered that there was no electrical wiring or nothing within the shed itself that could have caused the fire or caught fire. It was clear that that was not on fire on December 30th when people first arrived at the property and residents and firefighters were working to try to put out the flames. There is no evidence that the residents of 5325 El Dorado set a fire on December 30th. There's no evidence of that. I say that based on all the work that was done, but also there were approximately 40 people living in the structures at 5325 El Dorado at the time of the December 30th fire. Sheriff's Office investigators and District Attorney investigators interviewed all of the adults who were on the property at the time of the fire. There were also children there, and we utilized specially trained forensic child examiners to interview all the children who were on the property at that time to determine, did anybody start a fire on December 30th? And through all of the analysis and the interviews, we were able to determine that the fire was set on December 24th and that no one saw any smoke, flames, or indication of any fire whatsoever between December 24th and December 30th. To say that the investigators conducted a very thorough search of the property and of all the conduct that had happened in that week leading up to the fire would be fair. An incredibly thorough investigation was conducted, including a search of the entire property. So when we talk about criminal charges, when we look at a charge of arson, for example, there are two things I'll share with you that are elements for being able to prove a charge of arson. One is knowingly, which means someone knows or is practically certain that a result is going to come as a result of their conduct. If they know that what they're about to do is going to cause a certain result. Or recklessly. And under criminal law, not civil, but under criminal law, recklessly is defined as disregarding a substantial or unjustifiable risk. There's no evidence to indicate that when they set the fire on December 24th, that they had any knowledge that after covering it with dirt, that the embers would be uncovered by the wind, spark, and cause a fire on December 30th. In addition, there's no indication that they disregarded the substantial and unjustifiable risk when they started this fire on December 24th. I would highlight for you, as the sheriff mentioned, that on December 24th it was wet, rainy, and cool out. Also, it's important to note what the sheriff touched on, that the firefighters from Mountain View Fire responded on December 24th after a community member called in about the fire having been set on the property at 5325. The firefighters, a Boulder County Sheriff's deputy, and someone from Boulder County Open Space and Mountain Park Rangers all responded. They determined, Mountain View Fire did, that the fire, the way it had been set and their plan to extinguish it was reasonable and responsible. There's no way we could prove in court today that their conduct on December 24th was criminally reckless when the firefighters who were there determined that their conduct in setting the fire and their plan to extinguish the fire was in fact reasonable and responsible. And this is one of hundreds of fires that are used in Boulder County by property owners every year. The fire was then smoldering for 6 days and no sign of it until December 30th. I will say, just to give you an example of how you might want to look at this, if we take a step back from the fire for a minute, let's say you have a frozen lake and hundreds of people go on the lake without a problem. It's frozen solid. There's no signs prohibiting people from going on the lake. And on this particular day, a man takes a couple kids out onto the ice, and first responders come along and say the lake is frozen solid, you have nothing to worry about. And at some point thereafter, one of the kids goes through the ice. Is the man responsible? On some level, of course. But was he criminally reckless? No. So we look at the evidence and the law to determine what the right decision is here. Clearly on December 24th, when they set this fire, they had no idea that the high wind event, where winds were gusting up to 100 miles per hour, were going to happen on December 30th. They had no idea that this could spread and destroy over 1,000 homes. They did take, as the sheriff noted, and I think it's worth repeating for members of our community, they did take immediate action upon realizing that it was on fire to try to put the fire out. First responders did the same, and the fire quickly got away from everybody. I'll turn now to the Marshall Mesa Trailhead fire. I'm just going to step by you for 1 second. That's represented by the second red dot there, and as the sheriff indicated, it's more likely than not that that fire was caused by electrical equipment and wiring maintained by Xcel. It is possible that other causes of that fire are responsible. So it's possible, certainly, that embers could have gone from that top red dot down to the red dot you see at the bottom there. That's very unlikely, and very unlikely. I mean, it would have had to travel 2,000 feet going against a wind that was blowing at an incredibly high rate from west to east. And if you look at the two red dots and where they're lined up there, you can see that the second red dot is to the west, so in the opposite direction of where the wind was blowing. Obviously, wind changes directions at times, but it's extremely unlikely that any embers went from that first fire down to and caused the second fire. I will highlight, and something I'm going to come back to in a little while, is the location of the coal seam vents, because I think that's really important for people to be aware of. Can I step by you for 1 second? Sorry. I was told not to move away from the microphone while speaking, so. You can see this when you come up here after, and you'll also be able to see it on the sheriff's website, but I want to highlight for you, first fire is happening up here. Down here is the electrical pole maintained by Xcel. There were two specific areas represented by lines to these red boxes called specific area of origin, where investigators and experts believe fire may have started in this grassy area. There are green boxes, and I'm going to point to them, and I recognize you're at a distance now, but green box here, 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 and here. These are all coal seam vents in that exact same area. For the reasons the sheriff noted already and that I'll cover in a moment, we do not believe that the coal seam vent is responsible for the fire, but I want to highlight for you that these are all in the exact same area of what we're talking about here. Also, I want to highlight through this photograph that the specific origin area here and here, these two areas, one is (79.6 feet from the pole, and the other is 110.5 feet from the pole. So 79.6 and 110.5 from the pole in question. Seems more probable and more likely that it was the Xcel wire as opposed to embers from 2,000 feet away or the coal seam vents that caused the fire. I recognize that Xcel may not share that view. But the evidence we have and the input from the experts and the investigators and all the work that has gone into it led us to conclude that it's more likely that that second fire was started due to an Xcel wire that had become unmoored from the pole. The question for criminal charges, though, is whether Xcel was criminally reckless or negligent in their maintenance of that wire. So we looked at a number of things, and I will say that neither the investigators nor the experts found any evidence of criminally negligent or reckless system design or maintenance in connection with the equipment and wiring in that specific area. It appears that the extraordinarily high winds on December 30th caused the power line to disconnect and then contact other lines, and you see that in the photo there, the damage that was being caused, which caused arcing and hot particles to be then released into a bed of receptive fuel, as it's called, the grass that we had there. There was no evidence of worn materials, shoddy construction, or substandard conditions. Thus, no criminal charges could be proven against Xcel Energy for the role that it likely played, or their equipment likely played, in that second fire igniting at the trailhead there. From the expert's report, I would just read to you: no design, installation, or maintenance defects or deficiencies in that area. The poles, conductors, and insulators in that specific area were in good condition. So that's something we looked at very closely to determine whether there's any criminally reckless or criminally negligent conduct. So I'm going to touch on the decision about, or investigation into, the repair of the wires immediately following the fire. I will emphasize what the sheriff said, and I think it's an important point. The snow was coming down. It was freezing cold. People were without power. Pipes were freezing. There was concern that people were going to be driven out of the homes that were still standing, and there was demands that the power be turned on. In fact, some of law enforcement had engaged with Xcel to urge them and their massive response to this fire event to get the power back on as quickly as they could. So after the investigation, there's no evidence at all that they repaired the line in an effort to impede the investigation or hide something from criminal or civil proceedings. However, as the sheriff noted, when the investigators had initially responded, the wire that you could see disconnected here was no longer disconnected. Leaving no stone unturned, even though there was no indication that they had taken the step to repair the wire in an effort to hide anything from investigators, we wanted to confirm that. So we conducted an investigation into that aspect as well. And we were focused on where Xcel had issued a do not repair order to some of their employees. It was nearby there, or arguably in there. It's close by. And we interviewed the employees from Xcel and went through all the documents relevant to the repair, and there was no evidence whatsoever from any of those interviews or any of the documents that they repaired the wire to hide anything from investigators. Rather, it seemed entirely consistent with what law enforcement and community leaders had been asking Xcel to do, which was please get the power back on as quickly as possible. I'm going to turn now to the initial media reports and information shared on social media regarding Xcel's wires, because that's something we actually looked at as part of this investigation as well. The initial media reports indicated that downed power lines were responsible for the fire. As the sheriff has already shared with you, it was determined that it was a communications wire that was actually down, and we confirmed through the investigation and through the use of experts that the communications line could not cause a fire, given the amount of energy that travels through the communication line. However, we did focus on an update that was sent out by the Boulder Office of Emergency Management, which read, update on cause of fire. Initial reports were of downed power lines. Xcel Energy Co., this is on Twitter, has been a very responsive and invaluable partner, and after inspection found no downed power lines in the ignition area. That's true. There was a line that was floating and unmoored. The definition of a down line is that it's touching the ground. That's the definition that Xcel uses for a down line, means it's touching the ground. However, we wanted to, again, leave no stone unturned and make sure that that was not a miscommunication that was designed to mislead investigators at all. Speaking candidly, I will just say the communication could have been more clear on all sides of that. I'm just telling you my honest take on it. However, based on the review of the Xcel documents and interviews, there's no indication that there was an effort there to mislead investigators. The down power line is language they've continued to use since then. They've talked to members of the media about there being no down power lines. That, based on Xcel terminology, is technically true. An unmoored line for Xcel is considered a floater or a floating line. So when their Xcel personnel say down line, they mean something touching the ground. Underground coal fires, I think the sheriff covered it in detail. The only thing I would add to what the sheriff has said is after the 2005 fire that was caused by the coal vent, there were significant steps to mitigate that ever happening again. They dumped 275 tons of material into that area to cover up the underground coal mines. And they've continued to monitor it since, so rather than looking at any possibility they've been criminally negligent or reckless, in fact, they've taken steps to actively mitigate and monitor that site. The only other thing I would add to what the sheriff covered about the underground coal seam is that we also asked, after other high wind events since the Marshall Fire, for the temperature readings from the coal seam vents. So going back to 2005, for example, the temperature reading at the time of that fire was 373 degrees. After the mitigation, the temperatures were always below 90 degrees coming out of the coal seam vent. After the Marshall Fire, as part of this investigation, using thermocouples to monitor the temperature there, we asked, as part of the investigation, please let us know the temperature coming out of the vents after windy days. Of course, we cannot and could not replicate the wind that this community suffered from on December 30th, but on high wind days, there was no indication that there was ever enough temperature coming out of those coal seams as a result of the mitigation to cause a fire. The experts cannot rule it out conclusively, but those are some of the investigative steps we took in determining whether the coal seam was a likely cause of this fire or not. I'm going to turn it back to the sheriff in just a moment. I will say this. I'll say this. This community has suffered a lot. Our goal here today is to tell you everything that we know and determined about the cause and origin of the Marshall fires. This information is going to be available to all the community members. I'd be remiss if I didn't point to the strength and resiliency of this great community. And having been in the emergency call center and the disaster assistance center, along with members of our office and other community leaders and volunteers from throughout the community, one thing that really will always stay with me is the incredible response by our community and by this state to support those impacted. That does not end today. Their wounds do not heal today, and likely never will. But as people continue to rebuild, we rebuild as a community. One thing that a gentleman from FEMA told me at the Disaster Assistance Center was that he's never seen a community get a disaster assistance center set up as quickly as Boulder County. And his life, his job is traveling from disaster to disaster. And he's never seen a community respond with the resources, strength, and collective spirit that Boulder County did. When I think of this tragedy and all the lives devastated by it, I will always remember what he said about our response. I share that with you as a resident and as a person and as your district attorney. I'm going to turn it back over to the sheriff, though, to say a couple more things, and then we're happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you again for being here today.